It's interesting, the last time that our guest was here in this room was 5 years ago when we dedicated the Vignellis Center. And it's great to have him back. I remember at the time standing back there, and he and I connected for the first time. And I remember really wanting to have some time to chat with him because we kind of found a lot in common, and he knows so much about the history of St. Peter's and the Vignellis work. But there wasn't time then because it was the dedication and there were 1,000 people here and it was really busy. So we subsequently have had lunch in New York and have connected a couple of times, and I think today is just part of that continuing dialogue, and we're very happy. We had a wonderful discussion with my class at 2 o'clock, and we're going to have another kind of roundtable tomorrow morning at 9 if anyone's interested. Please come. But our guest is pastor at St. Peter's Church in New York, and he's a graduate, an alum of Oberlin College. He's a experienced musician, I guess, an organist, and then graduate work at the Yale Divinity School. Yes, that's right. He studied at the Institute of Sacred Music, receiving a master's in divinity degree and diploma in Lutheran studies, and a bachelor of music degree from Oberlin. So we have a multi-talented guest today, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Pastor Jared Stahler.
Thank you, Roger. So the first and most important word I wish to speak today is a word of thanks. Thanks to you who have come to hear this presentation. Thanks to Professor Remington and the staff and administration of RIT and the Vignelli Archive for the invitation to speak in this series of distinguished designers, despite my being neither distinguished nor a designer. Thanks really to all of you for your hospitality, which I've already felt so warmly in the few hours I've been here on campus. Thanks especially to Lela and Massimo, whose work, whose passion, in fact, is what brings us together this day. And thanks too to the people of St. Peter's Church, who in every generation fill what we call life at the intersection with creativity, commitment, and promise. So I've sectioned this talk into 5 major parts. You've heard one of them, the thanks. I want to give a little overview of the history of St. Peter's Church, leading to the point in which they took the decision to tear down what was called the old church and to build a partner in building Citigroup Center. And I'll talk a little bit about that process because I'm very much aware that there are a variety of stories that are float around, questions about air rights, all these sorts of things. So I'm going to try to give you a perspective on that. And then to delve a little bit into in a sense, literally what the talk, the title of the talk, Church Will Meet Vignelli, and to talk about the Vignelli process of coming into the project, and then to look at a couple of sort of examples of their particular work. Knowing the round table is tomorrow, I've that section can be changed. So if you want me to talk about something in particular and you haven't heard me talk about it, we can get to that. So, life at the intersection. The nascent community-focused venture that would eventually be called St. Peter's Church began more than 150 years ago in a rented loft above an Irish-owned animal grain feed store at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 49th Street. The church was a mission start of a church whose claim to fame is the first charter of religious tolerance in the colonies, St. Matthew's Church. at the time located on 6th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues in what was then Little Germany and is now called the Lower East Side. St. Peter's was a small but quickly growing community in a quickly growing section of Manhattan. Most everyone, German-speaking overflow from that historic neighborhood. Stereotypically German, they were organized, dedicated, motivated. Leaders saw that community moved swiftly from rented feed store into a property of their own, namely a former Presbyterian church building located at Lexington Avenue and 45th Street. On June 15, 1903, St. Peter's sold this building to New York Central Railroad for $200,000. The construction of Grand Central Terminal began shortly thereafter. So too did construction on a new home for St. Peter's. The site chosen was fewer than 10 blocks to the north at the intersection of Lexington Avenue and 54th Street. This structure would be the first church building the faithful people of this then 40-year-old venture would design and construct entirely from scratch. In the meantime, the community made temporary use of the Methodist Beekman Hill Church on 50th Street near 2nd Avenue. They were Germans. Construction did not take very long. In December 1904, the congregation moved into the new church. They were also practical. They moved into the new church's basement while the sanctuary was still being completed. The dedication of the then new St. Peter's Church took place May 14th, 1905, just 2 years after that land deal with New York Central Railroad. It was a very German, neo-Gothic edifice. A set of stairs led to an elevated sanctuary replete with carved high altar and statues galore, large stained glass windows, an imposing pulpit, and very rigid pews. Another set of stairs descended to an undercroft, that basement, used for community gatherings and where 5 decades later, Elaine de Kooning would set up an art gallery. St. Peter's thrived. The neighborhood was filled with people, and brownstones, and shops, and butchers, and cobblers, and probably as a harbinger of things to come, probably a bank or two. There were neighboring churches and synagogues, even a certain piano factory on Park Avenue between 52nd Street and 53rd Street, the present-day site of the Seagram Building. You know the anglicized name, but at St. Peter's, C.F. Theodor Steinway was known as Christian Frederick Theodor Steinweg, and he and his family gave the pipe organ for this then new church. However fascinating the history of St. Peter's may be, we do not have the time to rehearse it all here. With the little I have said, I hope that you have the sense of a strong community, a committed community, a dedicated community, a community dedicated to people, dedicated to the church, dedicated to the city of New York. A very German community in the heart of a New York with a very prominent German population. The single largest disaster in New York history prior to the September 11th attacks in 2001 changed all of that. The year was 1904. The day, June 15th. The event, a festive church picnic for members of St. Mark's Church and St. Peter's Church, both inheritors of that historic St. Matthew's Church. The passenger steamship General Slocum, chartered by St. Mark's to ferry people up the East River, caught fire at about 100th Street. The death toll from burning and drowning was over 1,000 men, mostly women and children. St. Peter's pastor, Edward Muldanky, overtaxed himself walking up and down the sidewalks where the bodies had been placed, attempting to identify each person. And then later, presiding over so many funerals, so that on June 25th, just 10 days after the disaster, he himself dropped dead. These deaths, coupled with the untold number of deaths sustained by the immediate preceding generation during America's bloodied Civil War, and still more deaths in the Great War yet to come, would dramatically and inexorably alter the population of New York City, alter the fabric of American society. A strong, honorable, and prominent German presence and participation in civic life, with roots all the way back to the Continental Congress in the personages of the Muhlenberg family. Friedrich, son of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, said to be the father of American Lutheranism, served as the first and third Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. This long and prominent tradition of German Americans would begin in these years to fade. By 1922, the neighborhood around the then new St. Peter's was already turning from residential to business. And of course, St. Peter's itself had something to do with that. Grand Central Terminal opened its doors in 1913. The Chrysler Building was completed in 1930. That very same year, construction began on Rockefeller Center. A year later, in 1931, the General Electric, or RCA Victor Building, opened just 3 blocks south of the 1905 St. Peter's Church. And from April 30th, 1931, until the topping off of the original World Trade Center tower in 1970, the Empire State Building, of course, was the tallest building in the world. The neighborhood was changing. Families moved away. The history of St. Peter's says this of the time period: "We responded by building a parish house with auditorium, stage, gym, bowling alleys, meeting rooms. In other words, a second home for our members. Yet the character of our church and our mission had to change along with our neighborhood. We opened our doors to everyone during the Depression. We became an anchor of Christian service in secular, bustling Midtown Manhattan." During the Second World War, this once bustling parish house became a dormitory for servicemen passing through New York City until June of 1946, when it was closed. Whatever German pride was left in America, it generally disappeared on account of the Second World War and the atrocities of the Holocaust, whose liberation we remember 70 years ago tomorrow. December of 1943, German language services were discontinued altogether at St. Peter's. By 1948, just 45 students were enrolled in Sunday school, down from 975 pupils and 95 teachers in 1887. With the end of the war and the GI Bill, most families that were left in this and other neighborhoods of New York City moved to Long Island or to New Jersey or to what we New York New Yorkers call upstate. I know that's downstate for all of you. If you're a fan of Mad Men, as I am, you know that the show presents a view into this time period. We watch on TV what so many experienced in real life over the course of the ensuing 3 decades following the Second World War. New York City emptying out, rampant crime, collapse all around, The elevated train on 3rd Avenue just to the church's east was the border zone for drugs, prostitution, gambling, the sorts of crime movies and, yes, TV shows are made of. To the point, the original P.J. Clark's, which makes an appearance in Mad Men, as a way of showing that even a spiraling admin like Don Draper has a limit to where he will go, is in this one-time border, just a minute's walk from my office, and where many Citicorp Center deals were hashed out. Initially, the period was a great time for business and culture. 1952, the United Nations headquarters gives New York City a prominence on the world stage it had never had before. Later that same year, Lever House opens. And in 1958, the Seagram Building. In 1961, First National City Bank moves from 55 Wall Street to 399 Park Avenue. That is the entire city block spanning Park Avenue to Lexington Avenue between 53rd and 54th Streets. The by now old St. Peter's is seen here behind the construction zone. A few more of the iconic buildings worth naming. 1963, there's the iconic Pan Am building, and in 1968, the General Motors building. Then it all practically stopped. Business people settling into a constant refrain. It's easier, safer, cheaper to build and to do business in Connecticut. Or, as Mad Men shows us, out in Los Angeles. And this, friends, is the crucial point. When, in the spring of 1974, Church meets Vignelli, life at the intersection of 54th Street and Lexington Avenue is bleak. The pressures on the city are tremendous. The downward spiral deteriorates into President Ford's 1975 speech denying federal assistance to spare New York City from bankruptcy. The ever-clever Daily News puts the president's recalcitrance this way: Ford to the city, drop dead. And of course, if the city's institutions with it, St. Peter's too. Here, as before, we cannot explore the details of the impressive and unprecedented land deal that brought about Citicorp Center and the new St. Peter's Church. I commend to you the panels of the exhibit, which I understand will be on display permanently or for a while this spring. They tell a good deal of the story, and I urge you to read them with this 100-year-long perspective I just articulated on your mind. Read them also with the story behind the story you will find on those boards, a story I can tell you only with a very large brush, which will paint only very crude brushstrokes, so my apologies for what I'm about to do. Life behind life at the intersection, or the life of life at the intersection in this period, came with an influx of then 20 and 30-somethings migrating to New York City from other parts of the country. That, combined with an entrepreneurial pastor, intrepid real estate agents, vice presidents and presidents of banks, visionary architects, unparalleled designers, artists, and urban planners. They all decided New York City was worth it. Worth investment, worth the risk, worth staking everything, even their reputations. And so they made a go at it with Citicorp Center, despite all the odds. The architect in charge, Easley Hamner, part of Hugh Stubbins and Associates, recently visited St. Peter's and reminded us that, quote, absent Walter Wilston and his board at First National City Bank, later called Citibank, having the vision to finance the acquisition and build the new building, nothing would have happened. In addition, if Riston had not overruled a senior vice president who suggested holding open the option of not building and moving to Connecticut, nothing would have been built. Instead, he exclaimed, "This is First National City Bank, and while I am chairman, we will honor our commitment to the city." Mr. Hamner continued, absent the support of John Lindsay, then mayor, and his Office of Midtown Planning and Development led by Lauren Otis, the form and size of the complex might have been severely compromised. Citicorp Center was about the city, not about making a buck. Point, in fact, the project cost the church and the bank alike much, much more money than the original cost estimates had projected. So this being an institution of higher education, of teaching and learning, I thought I'd make a point. Do great things. Don't do great things for money or for fame. To be sure, the deal then, and the many deals made at Citigroup Centers since, are some of the largest real estate deals this planet has ever known. It landed its pastor on the cover of Fortune magazine. But the story behind the story is this. This project was not undertaken for money. It was barely completed, requiring far more money than anyone imagined it would take, thanks to inflation, market fluctuations, and other uncontrollables. This project was undertaken by people who loved New York City, loved working together, loved the individual disciplines that they practiced, and all of that came together to make the impossible happen. The vision began to take shape in the 1960s, not with a new building, but with a new vision for ministry articulated in 1969, and after the decision was taken in 1970 to join this real estate project, leaders of the congregation began meeting with a preeminent architect, Edward Larrabee Barnes. Together, they developed a 1971 document for mission in New York City, and they called it Life at the Intersection. The bank ultimately secured Hugh Stubbins and Associates as architects, and while the church retained Barnes for some time, it became apparent to all that employing the same architect would be advantageous to all parties. Barnes very graciously stepped aside for others to carry out this vision of life at the intersection. Here are some of the pieces of life at the intersection. At the intersection of 54th and Lexington Avenue, our new church should be a landmark in Manhattan. It should be a bold architectural statement of Christianity's confidence in the future of this city, a counter-thrust to the glossy opulence of Park Avenue, the discordant noise and commercialism of Lexington. We want the building to have the feeling of an anchor of serenity in, but not withdrawn from, the sea of unpredictable turmoil around us, a place that offers entry to all and privacy on a human scale. They wrote that the technicalities of St. Peter's agreement with the First National City Bank are incorporated in our contract, which specifies that we may have a separate identity. What is that identity? We are a living, growing, changing congregation with deep roots in the past and a firm belief that humankind and humankind's divinity, nature, and humanity must not be overwhelmed as Midtown develops into a massive mosaic of high-rise towers. We want to influence that development. We see our identity as one of commitment, here and now, to the learning and application of the gospel within the daily life of this, and I'll add, crumbling city. Life at the intersection specifies outside seating areas and living plants. It seeks a sense of decompression upon entering the new church. There is to be a water sculpture at the entry related to the baptistry for the major worship area. It identifies 3 major uses for what totals an impressive 45,000 square feet, plus an additional 20,000 square feet of space that the church could acquire. Those 3 areas: assembly, daily living, and planned activities. To put the square footage in context, Breakers in Newport is 66,000 square feet. Life at the intersection envisioned a theater and green room space, the Duke Ellington Center, a music studio, a living room, a bookstore, a library, office spaces, classrooms, a heritage room for the older ladies who just couldn't let the old church go, a full-service kitchen, a sacristy, actually 2, narthex, a chapel, a large assembly space. There's no way to cover all of this, so we'll have to forego the daily activity and daily living and planned activities sections and focus instead on the major area of Vignelli Associates' work. That's the large assembly space, which is what that plus a few other spaces they were involved with. The leaders of St. Peter's described their vision for the assembly area this way: a capacity for seating. This is a grand scale, just listen to this description. A capacity for seating 900 people with no fixed pews. We wanted to have a feeling that is both open and personal, a sense of both the cosmos and the womb, not a mirror into our past, but a window into our future. Flexible for different worship arrangements, it should accommodate large and small groups, jazz and traditional services, movable symbols, movable icons, all kinds of free movement. No fixed altar, they said, but an organ with fixed pipes. And this is my favorite: flat floor. This major space should be able to accommodate 200 people without a feeling of emptiness. 900 people, 200 people. It should be elemental, reverberative, expressing God's presence, transcendent, giving identity and a sense of life and love. And like the outside of the building, it should have simplicity, modesty, integrity, serenity, but not without visual counterpoints. A serif, not a sans serif feeling, to prevent a bland, dull, or sterile appearance. It needs wonder, joy, mystery. By 1974, minutes of the church's design panel make clear that a consultant was required to undertake, in this order: 1, interior design; 2, building graphics; and 3, a total design theme for the institution, lettering, stationery, etc. The panel thought that the 3rd item, total design theme for the institution, was the most important consideration. It wrote in its minutes, if prospective consultants can handle an overall gestalt, an overall program, it said talents in number 1 and number 2 could be bonuses. Seeking primarily a designer for what otherwise might be called a corporate identity is precisely how church met Vignelli. Many of the most important graphic designers of the time, several of them quite young and just getting started were among them. Among them, Ivan Chermayev, Milton Glasser, and George Gizudi, whose archive, I understand, is housed here at RIT. The focus on graphics may be a reason the panel was focused on Massimo in this early phase, and not Massimo and Lella, who, when all was said and done, had spent far more time on the project than he, as attested to by committee minutes and by Massimo himself in the e-book tribute to Lella he published just before his death. Massimo was interviewed by the church's design panel on May 9th, 1974. Others were interviewed in the same week-long period. They were still, German efficiency there. There were no minutes of the panel's subsequent deliberations, only a series of carbon paper letters to interviewees, they're up on the screen, expressing thanks, each one containing the phrase, quote, "It goes without saying that a number of members of the church wished to establish a relationship with you," and each concluding with the news that the church had selected Vignelli Associates. A detailed contract sent by Massimo to the church is dated June 10th. Pastor Ralph Peterson's signature is dated June 27th. The church had secured its graphic designer for its new public identity. And it had far more than that, far more even than interior design and building graphics. A few years ago, I asked Massimo why he thought Vignelli Associates was chosen ahead of some of these others. His answer, we could do it all. Graphics, interior design, objects. Lella and Massimo have often described St. Peter's as their most important project, which, given the enormity of their work, despite how much I love St. Peter's, I could not believe the first time I heard it. But very quickly came to know that statement to be absolutely true. Massimo was fond of quipping that designing a church was good insurance for the next life. More seriously, among their vast oeuvre, St. Peter's is the only full, complete project with everything, inside and out, designed by them. Massimo, the graphics, Lella, the silver and many of the church's objects, together a great deal of the environment. One singular project in which they worked distinctly and very much together on everything. I must pause and, particularly in this hall, ensure history gives proper credit to Henry Alczek, a young and supremely talented Vignelli associate. Henry was indispensable to and is remembered fondly by all involved in the project, by Lella, by Massimo, and lay leaders of St. Peter's alike. I imagine another reason the project is beloved by them is the fact that it is a church with promise to shape the lives of countless people. It's no secret, Massimo styled himself a priest. All black, and the defining silver tab he wore nearly every day. He was always jealous of this. And I was always jealous of that, so he could have. Whether he wanted to be the high priest of design or the best designed high priest, we'll never know. Either way, it's as the saying puts it, the two different sides of the very same coin. For a generation spanning pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity, St. Peter's allowed Lella and Massimo to do what they, certainly what he, always wanted to do: shape the church as they hoped it could be. And they were not alone. The same goal was shared by the pastor at the time, Pastor Ralph Peterson, by the young, creative members of St. Peter's. Shaping the church that could be, a city that could be, was the goal of everyone involved in the project. They were designing a church for the city of New York, a goal of many in a generation shaped by the vicissitudes of war. A playful story Massimo told as often as he could captured the shared sense of this real possibility, particularly in those years after the Second Vatican Council, those years of dreaming a new and unprecedented venture. When Pastor Peterson called to invite him to design St. Peter's, he naturally thought the project to be St. Peter's in Rome. The logo is good, he wanted to say to the Pope, but everything else, start over. Massimo and I shared an immediate affinity for one another. I remember our very first conversation vividly. I said this to Roger, in this presentation or any other place, I won't break any confidences of long conversations that I've had with him or countless other people, but I will say this because he has said it elsewhere. Sitting together at his desk, he told me he felt his role as a designer was to rid the world of trash. Bad design, flimsy and irresponsible. You can just hear him saying that. And I'll tell you what I told him, still true today. I feel my role as a pastor is to rid the world, to rid the church of trash, of bad theology, flimsy and irresponsible. It's a great privilege to have known Massimo and Lela and to share this common passion, namely the well-being of people. Come to think of it, it's the people that make this project the most memorable, the most important, the most beloved. St. Peter's Church is the work of the great big Vignelli family. Silver by San Lorenzo in Massimo's hometown of Milan, and much of the exquisite woodwork done by Pierluigi Gianda from the same city. The original renderings of the living room stipulate furniture by Paltranova, and the proposal for sanctuary glass by Vanini. Lela's beloved friend Arnaldo Pomodoro cast the striking exterior cross. In the 1990s, Dale Chihuly presented the fantastic exhibition called Persian Window. The company that made the white painted steel processional torches and other bases, each one of them was given to St. Peter's as a gift. All Italia flew the Pomodoro cross from Italy to New York, free of charge. I am amazed that 40 years after the project's completion, each time I meet a person involved with the creation of Citicorp Center, church members and professionals alike, they remember each other's names, they recount fond memories, they ask about their relatives, and each affirm what Lela and Massimo have said. This is my most important project. Earlier I said this project was not about money, but about the well-being of the city. The well-being of the city and its people. The St. Peter's project is very much the story, in this sense, of modernism. The Vignellis and other Italians involved in the project lived the early and formative years of their life under Mussolini. Nearly everyone involved in the project had endured war, which cut resources below bare necessity, resulting in valuing, in prizing everything. I am mindful that a project, a time such as this, is unique, never possible again, or at least I pray is never possible again. This world need not, ought not ever face such horrors, which is why I think what you're doing here, what you are studying here is so important. May we never face what these people faced, but may we also go forward responsibly, not forsaking their hard-earned lessons, but learning from them. For in our own time, we will not be remembered by what we did with little, but what we do with much. So some examples of doing much with very little, because that's the story of St. Peter's. So in the final segment, I'll take the project outline of Life at the Intersection as a guide and share with you some observations and experiences of church having met Vignelli. Recall that the document said, capacity for seating 900 people with no fixed pews, able to accommodate 200 people without a feeling of emptiness. The official fire safety capacity of the sanctuary and the living room combined is 575 people. While a good deal less than envisioned, it is no less substantial. The Vignelli brilliance is that when we set up all those chairs in the living room as overflow space for the sanctuary, it is not the typical experience of overflow where one feels as though one is seated in a small lobby somewhere, straining to hear and to see. Nor is it the experience of being completely outside the space. When every single one of those red fire doors separating the living room from the sanctuary is open, it is as though they all but disappear. And because those doors are set back some 20 feet or so from the border of the sanctuary, and because the low ceiling in the living room aligns with the low ceiling in the sanctuary, the space has the feel of one contiguous environment. It's amazing. I've just gone and sat out there in the living room just to experience what is it like on festival Sundays like Easter, or public talks like the one we had with Senator Elizabeth Warren and Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, with full capacity crowds. It's an amazing space, that near impossible simultaneous feeling of spaciousness and grandeur and familiarity and intimacy. The same is true for a single event with multiple expressions, like our annual all-night soul festival, New York City's longest continuously running jazz festival, or the annual celebration of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where the sanctuary serves as a performance venue and the living room a festive, related, and who knows what goes on out there, marketplace. The brilliance is even better. Smaller crowds, 200 or 100 in number, with most people sitting in the pews, and perhaps a few in the bleacher seats, also gives this feeling of fullness. And I think the gem is the intimacy of 20 or 30 people gathered for a small funeral mass, a chamber recital, an organ concert, or individual meditation for that matter. With the bleacher seats closed, everyone situated on the floor, with a good deal of unused space covered by the overhead, with the crisp acoustic, with the plain yet majestic space, with these soaring ceilings, and with thanks to the office tower's cantilevering a virtually columnless space, a small gathering taking place in the middle of this expansive sanctuary does not feel like the environment is imposing or empty, but as though one is held in something greater than yourself. It's peaceful and rejuvenating. It's what Life at the Intersection called the feeling of openness and personal, a sense of both the cosmos and the womb. And thanks to the Vignellis, the grand skylight designed by the architect to bifurcate the space in a striking and definitive way, both for the exterior and interior, is not a hindrance, as many prominent scholars, designers, and liturgical experts of the time had feared, but instead is one of the church's greatest assets. Massimo and Lella immediately saw the problem of the architect-defined orientation of the sanctuary below this skylight. It was oriented toward the great wall, the great north wall of the sanctuary, parallel to the entry of the plaza. The result was not simply a very perilously and permanently defined forward-facing arrangement. It was also bland and at odds with the skylight itself. The Vignellis suggested, and the church and architect agreed, to a 45-degree clockwise shift in the ground floor plan. Let me see if I can just point that out. The one here on the left, you see, is that with the arrow is oriented just sort of straight ahead. And you see that the sort of band that's running this way, that's representative of the skylight. And what they suggested would happen is that the whole thing would turn 45 degrees so that the floor plan and the lights would align. These drawings, by the way, are not Massimo's. I asked him. I took them to the apartment. I said, "Are these yours?" And he said, "No, they must be the drawings of a member of the committee who was watching him sketch." There were a number of well-trained designers and architects on the design panel. The shift that they suggested and was accomplished is amazing. It does not define a front or a back or a side, for that matter, in a space which is essentially in the round, but simply focuses attention on that central axis of the sanctuary. The shift also created these wonderfully small spaces like the ambulatory, which is that fancy word for that sort of entry place to the left there. The liminal space between what's the outside plaza and the sanctuary on the inside. And this wonderful space, you actually see, if you look at this drawing right here, that would have just been open directly in from these great big glass windows, just look straight on into the sanctuary. When they turned it, they could put a wall there. And it's, I think some of the most fantastic things about Vignelli design is their ability to make spaces within spaces. I figure in churches, they picked that up, in Milan, the Milan Cathedral, spaces within spaces within spaces. But this ambulatory that gets created it's fantastic because you can be in the space, but not really in the space. You could peek in, you could stand there, you gather there, you could choose to meet there. Some people have coffee there. They also created a number of other spaces. There's the walkway on the west of the church. There's a ramp that comes into the sanctuary. It's sort of concealed. And then, of course, that interchange with the living room that I previously mentioned. And then there's the great big main entrance, let's see if I can go back, that wraps around the upper level of the church. All of that really it just started to make sense when they suggested, let's just turn this 45 degrees. The archivist will receive a large file about that big of minutes that led to that decision. It was not an easy sell. In this new arrangement with the sanctuary, the floor plan of the sanctuary slightly turned. The skylight now helps the space. It doesn't hinder it. During the day, it sends fantastic light patterns zipping across the sanctuary that are infinitely varied throughout the year as the sun changes its place in the sky. And at night, the same skylight casts the shadows of the city onto those great big walls of the sanctuary. It's a really living space. It reveals, I like to think of it this way, the city stars, that is, the office windows, illumined or not, as their occupants or those who care for them turn the lights on and off. And perhaps the view I admire most is the one facing toward Lexington Avenue, as in this picture, and what is, for now at least, an unobstructed view of Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building. That's what I see every time I preside or preach at St. Peter's. No fixed pews, not a mirror into our past, but a window into our future. Flexible for different worship arrangements that could accommodate large and small groups, jazz and traditional services, movable symbols, movable icons, all kinds of movable things, no fixed altar. At St. Peter's, everything moves. Everything transforms. The idea of unfixed seating, however, is a really old one in churches. Cathedrals are traditionally vast open spaces meant to accommodate whatever pilgrims are arriving that day and whatever number they might be arriving. And the churches in the East, there, people largely stand for liturgies. I like to joke with my Orthodox friends that they're still standing for the Easter Vigil. From the very beginning, the Vignellis preferred pews in such a flexible space, preferred pews to chairs, and the chairs' unsightly legs and awkward sight lines underneath them. The earliest, this is not a sketch, this is a model. It's actually a model we've lost. So if anybody knows where it is, had, if you look, chair-like pews. I think that's interesting. Which what appear to be, at least in this model, could be quite grand and individual place settings. The final product, which you see up here, seats 3. And as you can see there, the cushions have a tremendous amount of color. The space is otherwise beige and the windows are clear. This is the church's stained glass. You can, if you imagine the, old Gothic church with wonderful stained glass windows as the light shines through, and it casts these wonderful patterns. We have to look in the archive. My memory serves me correctly. There are something like in the teens of patterns, like maybe 19 seems too many, or maybe 15 different patterns, because there are all these different color combinations, and then the placement of the colors changes. So when you look down at St. Peter's at this array, it's even though it's the same, limited number of colors and this recurring pattern, you get this feeling of infinite. And then, with their combinations sitting one next to each other. This, by the way, is the second set. These were hand made by members of the congregation. When the church opened, it took them several years to do it. And then in the last couple of years, we've been replacing those as they wear. And you should the archive is great because you have all of the sketches for the various ideas, some of them more out of control than the others. And we were just watching this video with Lela, who said in this video in 1982 that one of the ideas was to put a cross on there, and they thought, well, you probably shouldn't sit on the cross. So, but it's not simply these pews that move, but those platforms that you see, the bleacher seating, which when it's closed, so you see the bleacher seating there is open to the left of the organ. When it's closed, you just flip it down. You have a performance area. So the choir, for example, next to the organ can be seated, they can stand up, they can close the lid, and they can stand and huddle together and get ready to sing. The sanctuary's movability allows for infinite flexibility of this space, making it possible to arrange it so that it fits the needs of an event rather than the other way around. It means that whatever is happening in the sanctuary, it looks as though the sanctuary were built for that event. I'd like to say a word about the altar. And in response to a model of the new St. Peter's Church, and I don't think it was a model, the one that you just saw. Christer Stendahl, who was then Dean of Harvard Divinity School, wrote a letter dated June 25th, 1974. He wrote this: "The space is just glorious. This is obviously a building that will function as a cathedral, not just as a congregation. I would strongly suggest feel that if it needs to be a temple, it needs a permanent and fixed point, a stable and granite altar. If the baptistry is to be strong and sculpted, which I very much like, there must also be an altar which provides a counterbalance." I don't believe that Stendhal's letter is a critique of the Vignelli design. There would have been no way for them to come up, even if Fast Massimo works, to come up with a new design for this space 10 days after they signed the contract. But it's been one of the kind of things that's been circulating about that, Christer Stendhal doesn't like and he's a big name, he was but I think he was referring to some other earlier model. I'd like to say that the Vignellis provided for Stendhal's very ideas, his very critique. While the altar is not granite, it is large and imposing. It's very heavy, unmistakable, and its weight means it's not very easy to move. Its treatment, all wood, allows it to be present as it interplays with the wood around it in the sanctuary, but not overwhelm the sanctuary. So its use is actually what defines it. Somebody standing behind it or some object on it. And I think the tiered baptismal font is similar. Of course, it's made of granite, but it's built into those steps. We'll never know if the Vignelli solution was acceptable to the once illustrious dean of Harvard Divinity School, but I can tell you about years of experience. Yes, sometimes we have people who want to float candles or flowers in the font, most notably a taping of Good Wife. Most times people want to push the altar out of the way or stack various things atop it. I suppose that's the downside of something looking so accessible. But the upside of the very same thing is this. When Vignelli meets church, altar and font are, just as life as the intersection stipulates, accessible. Okay, now we're going to have some fun. The organ. This is an area where Massimo deserves a lot of credit. Ready for this? The original proposal for the organ, could you imagine this in St. Peter's? The original proposal for the organ was a 3-manual instrument by Kleis Orgenblau in Bonn, Germany. Its shape and placement were all, to use Massimo's words, wrong. So he immediately went to work, learning about what, prior to the 20th century, was, with the clock, the most complicated of mechanical devices. He flew to Germany, spent a week with the organ builder, and explained that he wanted to move the instrument away from that great big wall to the point between the walls, because that's the perfect place for amplification. And after learning that the instrument could take any shape, quickly decided it should be a square. We assume that this sketch is from that trip. It's housed here in the archives. What is remarkable is that in short order, he did this lickety-split. This is precisely what came to be. Look at the difference between that little sketch, right? And that. It's almost nothing. So there's one little hiccup in the organ. He asked the question, because he's going to do this square, what size is the largest pipe that needs to fit into that case? Well, the answer is 16 feet. So very proudly, he designed a case that would fit a 16-foot pipe. Except that the organ builders forgot to tell him that they needed to have a space for the wind chest to sit below the pipe. So the very lowest pipes of the organ are what they call Haskellized. They're 8 feet in length with a stopper at the top so that the sound goes up once and twice. Therefore, it produces a 16-foot sound even though the pipe itself is only 8 feet in length. The other thing he told me he was disappointed by, Chris, if you've been to St. Peter's, you know that on the other side of the organ is the window that's right at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 54th Street. And it's actually the source of some of the wonderful light that comes into the sanctuary. There's a building 3 blocks north of us that has pink glass, and when the sun hits that and bounces behind there, you get this fantastic pink glow behind the organ. It's wonderful, and you see in this picture just the light. Anyhow, the trackers, all the mechanical devices that run from the key desk up to the pipe, all run back and then up this section. And he was under the impression that it would be built in such a way that you would see all of that, so that on Lexington Avenue you'd peek in and you could see the trackers moving. It would be of some interest and liveliness. He was terribly disappointed when he learned that all of that was enclosed. It's a fantastic instrument. So now on to what Massimo calls home, the columbarium. He wanted nothing more than to be buried at St. Peter's, as he put it, home, eternal home. In the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic decimated New York City and other cities, and St. Peter's was not immune. So many members of the congregation died of HIV/AIDS, and so many churches at the time refused to bury people who had died of that disease. Their ashes were being scattered in various places, and oftentimes without families present. St. Peter's sought to give dignity as well as a public witness in the midst of this crisis. It began a project that would take some time to construct this columbarium. This is not original to the church. We have a letter, the exchange of letters between Lella and Massimo and the church, who, when asked if they might do this and explained what it would be for, were just elated, delighted to engage in the project. And just the one stipulation was that they could be inurned here and always be housed flush left. So last year we faced something we hadn't expected. Every section of the columbarium, every panel, has the name of the person on one line and their birth and death dates on another. I hope you can see some of those names. We had a member of the congregation die last year whose full name could not fit on one line. What to do? Well, a number of options were discussed between St. Peter's staff and the engravers. Center the text, keep the dates aligned, move the name up, keep the names alive, move the name down. We weren't certain what to do, and so Massimo was still alive, and a very quick telephone call to him, and this was his answer. This is amazing. Just like the organ. This is a 40-year gap. There are the stops of the organ. You keep the first line absolutely consistent. For an organist, of course, this means that she doesn't have to jump her eyes up and down, like where is the name of the stop beginning? No, it's all consistent. On the columbarium, it would maintain the consistent line across all of those panels. And that's the panel with the 3 lines. I've heard many people speak about Vignelli consistency, but this is remarkable to me. Not just one project, but many projects in this building across a lifetime of work. It just simply says, just like the organ. It's not simply good design. It's Vignelli design. I haven't said much about the graphic program or many of the objects of the church, and I want to leave time for questions. So I would commend to you these panels. We pulled a lot from the archives, as much as we could, from the St. Peter's Archive, and the archive here shared a number of things, and so we've tried to present a very comprehensive study of those plans. And I'm really glad we're at a particular point in St. Peter's history where we just brought on a new director of communications, and he's revisiting and reapplying the graphic standards which had deteriorated over the years. I don't want to fix blame on St. Peter's or on anybody, but just simply saying that unlike the MTA, which had a graphic standards manual, the Vignellis simply did this work for St. Peter's for a long time. And so no graphics standard manual for St. Peter's was ever developed. So that sounds like a fantastic master's thesis for someone. The objects here are some of the silver pieces. They're made by the San Lorenzo shop in Milan. We don't really use this piece much anymore. This is called the ciborium. It takes its name from the kind of covering. This is where you would put the consecrated hosts for Mass. It's fairly large. This is my favorite piece. Again, we use bread now as opposed to hosts, so this we really don't use. But I just love the sphere, perfect sphere, and then the riser here. So this is so highly polished, and if it were really polished, it would be really highly polished. And then this treatment here, if you come up and look at it, you'll see that these lines these grooves are, each one of them is different. It's all done by hand with a tool that no one knows where it exists now. This, if you know their work well, the barware collection that's in people's homes, but also in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, this is the same treatment. The piece that's shared between the sacred and the very profane, which we all like to take part in, is the water pitcher. But anyhow, then this is the chalice and paten, cup or plate. And I think what's fantastic about all of these things are related in size and scope, and nothing is gigantic. It's all very that sense of intimacy and home, really. The same treatment here, and then the paten has all of the pieces, even the thurible, which has the very, very tiny foot to it, have this fantastic treatment here, so that you get this play on light, refracted light and then reflective light. And then if you've ever had a meal with Massimo, you know that he likes to clean up very quickly. That's the Hellerware is made to do that. So you make a mess when you have communion, and you have all kinds of dirty linens and whatever. You just throw it all in here, and you do that, and it's clean. We are expanding this set, and I wish that I could have brought. We just had more chalices commissioned, and they have a slightly different treatment to them because the man who knew how to do these lines and the tool, he's dead, and the tool is gone. And anyhow, it's a fantastic new treatment that San Lorenzo has come up with, and a real gift to us that for this continued relationship with them. So let me conclude now, and then maybe open up for some questions. But conclude with the final words from Life at the Intersection. The space should have simplicity, modesty, integrity, serenity, but not without visual counterpoints, a serif, not a sans serif feeling. To prevent a bland, dull, or sterile appearance, it needs wonder, joy, and mystery. No one intended it, but there's a very Vignelli joke in that statement. Shall it be Helvetica? Shall it be Times New Roman? No, St. Peter's is Optima. Timeless, elegant. Church, Vignelli. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Oh, fantastic.
I was at Unity Temple for about 3 years, and so when we were talking about the history, it just reminded me of all the history, and it felt like I was listening to the Noble Room history.
Mm.
One of the things that, as a tourism manager there, the church itself had some problems because we were a historic designated site, and so we had tourism.
Mm.
And the church had problems with all those tourists coming through. And the other thing that they were trying to do is they were trying to grow the congregation. Unity Temple was built for only about 400, and that's when people were much smaller. And you were saying at 900, and I know one of the things that the Unity Temple was doing is they're actually looking at building a new building for the congregation and letting the historic landmark be what it is.
Mm.
Is that happening at all with St. Peter's? How
Um,
many people does it, how many people are in the congregation now?
That's a really good question. We are growing rapidly. Part of that is that there are parts of New York City that have people in them that have never had people in them. And with the ease of movement by train and being a church that has such a developed program, we are seeing a lot of people. So we have 4 liturgies on a Sunday, what used to be a small 8:45 Mass in the Louise Nevelson Chapel of the Good Shepherd, which is an entirely sculptural environment. That has been a sort of sleepy 8 or 9 or 10 people, and we are regularly in the 20s, and the space seats 21 or 22 people. So that's new for us. The 11 o'clock Mass, which is in the sanctuary, is almost constantly at the sort of regular capacity of the sanctuary. This isn't dragging out chairs and opening every single bleacher seat there is, and having people sitting behind people awkwardly, or and that's fantastic. It's amazing. The church planners, if that goes on, I mean, the question is that sustainable, or do we need to? I don't know. we don't have an answer to this, because you would typically. It is not, right? So you would typically start another service, would be your response. But we don't really have room, because at 1:30, our very sleepy Spanish-speaking congregation has very quickly become a very unsleepy Spanish congregation, and it's just an amazing number of people in the sanctuary. That's at 1:30, and then we have St. Peter's is sometimes called the Jazz Church. We have a long and jazz ministry. Jazz Vespers is at 5 o'clock, and now that is generally very heavily populated. So I don't know what the answer to this is. I think the experience for us at this point, with this kind of constant capacity all day long, is relatively new. The big deal there has been the uptick in the Spanish-speaking congregation. For us, we're trying to figure this all out. The church is not landmarked. It's coming to that point in terms of the time frame. The interior of the Seagram building has been landmarked, or the interior first 15 feet. Landmarking is as you know, it's not. There are upsides and there are downsides. So we're currently actually building building what we're calling the Zion Center. The Spanish-speaking congregation is a combination of our Spanish-speaking ministry and a formerly homeless Spanish-speaking ministry, and they're combining together. And so they're building a new chapel-like environment that will be larger than the chapel, smaller than the sanctuary, and it'll be interesting to track when that's complete what happens. But yeah, this question of space and size for a congregation, right? That people were emptying out. On a good day, if you had 100 people, that was fantastic. This is a great challenge to have. We're just not quite certain where to go with it. But the typical response is to add another liturgy, which is possible for us. It would be probably like 7:30 at night or something like that. We're not quite at that point yet.
Did the Vignellis themselves or their family attend St. Peter's?
So it's interesting. I was looking through the archive, and they were, of course, at the dedication of the sanctuary, and it was really cool to look at the photo credits. Luca took almost a great deal of the photographs from the dedication of the sanctuary, which is cool. Massimo and Lella would show up from time to time on occasion. I was ordained on December 1st, 2007, and I was just delighted when I looked out into the congregation and saw Massimo there. It was just a real treat. And of course, he's there now all the time, as he says. Yeah. Other questions? Surely there are more. Yes?
The graphic you
Yeah.
have here, and I noticed like on the front of the altar, or not
Yeah,
the
on the
lectern, there was
yeah, you see it here. So this is what we call the St. Peter's cross. As Roger was pointing out, it resembles the so-called Jerusalem cross or the Crusaders' cross. Its history to getting to St. Peter's is via Sweden. There were, as I mentioned in the talk, a number of people in the congregation, and still are, who are architects or designers, and they had already begun in the 60s, and in some examples, the 50s, developing a logo for the church based on that cross. And you get all sorts of fantastic, really playful iterations of it. There's letterhead that has the cross being built like along the letterhead. It's just repetitive, like one piece, then two pieces, then three pieces, and then at the very bottom is the full cross. And so sometimes Massimo made like all new logos. I think his genius is when he would take a logo that was pre-existing and give it new life today. I mean, you think about the American Airlines logo, that's precisely what he did. When American Airlines decided to do a whole new graphic campaign, they didn't jettison his logo, they jettisoned, the whole history of that company. So what he did was to say, you are using this cross, it has some meaning. They had already started to talk about the intersection, that the cross itself forms Lexington Avenue and 54th Street. And so what he did was to take what had been like a pencil-thin drawing of that cross. You can see, I wish I could have a better example of it up close, but you see it in a sense on the pulpit. And he first made it all relational, so that, I wish I had brought the burst down because it's on there, so that both the bars of the cross and the white space, the negative space, were all related. Then he had this idea, and this is then totally his, that if you take that's the red, right? If you take that and drop a shadow behind it, then you have, in a sense, the same cross, one that is 3D and one that's flat. Oh, here's a good example. I just thought about it. So the textile that's hanging back there has the sort of flat St. Peter's cross on it. So that section that comes down the middle is thought to be Lexington Avenue. The cross beam is 54th Street, and the little kind of L-shaped or boomerang-shaped pieces that you see on the sides there, that's, does my pointer go up there? I don't know. Probably not. Those are the sidewalk spaces, and then the squares on this outside are the skyscrapers, and then of course the outside, very most outside things are, well, that would be Park Avenue, that would be 3rd Avenue, that would be 55th Street, and that would be 53rd Street. The idea really was that here is the city in this logo. And then the 3D version kind of had this sense that something is growing, which I'm assuming might have related to the building. There's a line sketch that they have from like the late 60s of the cross kind of growing up like a slinky. So yeah, as he said to me once, we actually have some bulletins where the name St. Peter's Church is below the cross, and then very quickly he started to put it above the cross. And he said to me once, he said, the cross does not need a caption. So it's a really very, very powerful logo.
You talk like you know a lot about design.
Just from
Is this
being there all the time.
Experience with the Vignellis been, in a way, your design education?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I practically live in the space. So you can't help but start to see things and pick things up. I think that's one of the most remarkable things about St. Peter's. It is not flashy, it is not showy, it is not it's not bold, and but there are details, and I can come back to the very same object or place in the church, and every single time I see something new. We every Good Friday, the St. Peter's Choir presents the Bach St. Matthew Passion in a 3-hour liturgy. And I was sitting behind the pulpit presiding. And, I mean, it goes on for 3 hours. I'm a musician. I love St. Matthew's Passion. But, sometimes sitting for 3 hours, it gets a little boring. And so I'm looking around, and the choir is sitting to my left, and they have the bleacher seat. Someone had opened one of the bleacher seats. And I'm just looking at the grains of the wood and the panels of that butcher block all lined up, and I'm just following those same lines across the pulpit. And I'm thinking, my God, a pulpit which could move anywhere in this building, and all of these bleacher seats all lined up perfectly. So I think it's literally being in the building, being really immersed in it, and seeing things, just opening my eyes. And then of course, you walk a 3-block radius of St. Peter's, the Lever House, Seagram Building. I mean, there's a lot to sort of study. And then watching Massimo. I mean, we're blessed I've been at St. Peter's 10 years, and the 10 years essentially of time with him. And we would do new projects, new commissions. There are candle votives that we did a couple of years ago that look like they were just built for the space way back when. And I think the thing was just sitting with him at his desk, and he would just start drawing, and he'd be talking about it. Or when Lella was well, and I would go up, and they would both be critiquing one another, just observing that and taking that in. What is like a design education.
So maybe we need to give you an honorary MFA in design.
My mother would be proud. Did you have a question? You had a question?
My question was really more about like what Roger said.
Okay.
Your presentation
How to-
was very well done with talking about design, but it also reminds me of something that I heard once, that God is in the details.
That's Mies, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
What you
Yeah.
just described
Yeah.
Just like,
Yeah.
that would be me. I can
Yeah.
get the open space.
Oh yeah, they're it's all over the place. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So in the archive, there are some sketches of robes
Oh yeah.
or something.
Yes.
Do those go anywhere?
Yes. I haven't seen them, but my guess is that they're the choir robes. I mean, when I say they designed everything, they designed everything. And you can actually tell the stuff that they didn't design because it just doesn't really work. The choir robes, which are these, if correct, I'll describe them and you tell me if this is that, but they're beige and they're long flowing. They're very much like the suits that the clothing from the Design Vignelli line. And they have this simple tie here. They're really, they're wonderful in the sense that they come in all different sizes. They fit anyone and they look good on anyone. They didn't design, it always sort of puzzled me why they didn't design vestments for the clergy. But I learned recently that the idea of the pastor of St. Peter's, Ralph Peterson, who came from the Swedish tradition, wearing the traditional mass vestments for an old school German church when he first became pastor they weren't happy with him. And in fact, the worship committee told him that he couldn't, and he did it anyway. And in fact, he then commissioned a whole set of vestments that were designed in the last 3 or 4 years of the old church's life. And they take as their inspiration the old stained glass windows, which was a huge issue when they were tearing down the building. There was a whole contingent of people very worried about the stained glass windows. In fact, they were promised that the stained glass windows would form a very nice Gothic chapel. And of course, never happened, and that was not the plan. The plan all along was a Nevelson chapel. But I think that those vestments, having been essentially newly designed, newly paid for by a well-regarded artist, and echoing the now beloved but gone stained glass windows, it was probably just not politically right to do it. We've actually commissioned a couple of new vestments that I think pick up their design sensibilities quite well, but the idea is simple, simple, simple. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. The sanctuary, this is amazing. The chairperson of the building committee was an engineer, a member of St. Peter's. And so the question of sound was a very important question very early on. And they had a robust jazz program by this point, a growing classical music program. And they wanted to be a place that people would come and perform at. So the question of sound was from the very beginning. Of course, the Lexington Avenue subway line runs directly under St. Peter's, so this is a particular problem. So what the engineers figured out is that the sanctuary sits in a double acoustical shell, so that there are 2 shells, and between the 2 shells is like an oil-like substance that allows the whole sanctuary to the whole shell compartment to vibrate, so that as the train goes by, it absorbs. You cannot hear the train at all, even though it runs right by it. And it also helped to isolate the sound from the street noise and from other parts of the building. There is amplification in the sanctuary. The original system was probably a pretty simple amplification system of the time. The Vignellis actually designed these very tall cabinets for the speakers. That system was replaced in the late 90s, early 2000s with some cabinets kind of designed in the style, and they're now failing. And we just are actually beginning the process of rethinking amplified sound, and also asking this question of, again, of video and sound feeds and video feeds. And so hopefully in the next couple of, I would hope in the next couple of years, there will be some major upgrades. And my hope is that with the speaker technology being what it is today, that we can actually do what I think would make Massimo very happy, which is have the speakers disappear entirely. And they're just, in the room and you don't even know that they're there. The track lighting around the sanctuary that you see there is actually a combination of track lighting and ventilation. He combined as much as he could so that you minimize the intrusion on the space. So I have this dream that somebody has made a speaker somewhere that can be added to that track. Yeah. Yeah. As long as we adhere to one of the 9 fire marshal approved arrangements of the sanctuary, the sound amplification is good because it assumes, all of these assume that the relationship will be on that central axis. If we do something that's kind of odd or tricky or off of it, then one, it doesn't look right, and then 2, it doesn't sound right either. But generally speaking, the sound is good. And I'm hopeful in this new, this third time we'll go back and revisit sound, that will improve even more. There was a question over here.
This isn't technical, but you made a real passing remark about turning the good light.
Yeah.
What was that about?
They did a couple of, we were because it's set in Chicago, we were a Baptist church in Chicago. It was a cool experience. They came in and in a sense it was like the perfect backdrop because it's all about people in robes and this kind of stuff. So it became, you wouldn't even know that it was shot at St. Peter's. I mean, you'd have to look pretty carefully. And the font was filled with floating candles, and it was interesting. But that happens. We've had a number of shoots both in the sanctuary and then in other parts of the building, and it's always, what people do is creative. I'll tell you, I don't watch Saturday Night Live all the time, but we've been approached twice by Saturday Night Live to be a shoot, and in both cases, the ultimate sketches that happen, I'm like, that should have been at St. Peter's.
Massimo designed all of the things that took place and the sort of the choreographed the memorial service. Is that right?
Yeah.
That was my understanding.
It was very heavily curated by him.
So he planned ahead.
Yes. No, I mean, the you can see it in Design as One. There's a section where they actually go up to the columbarium, and he says, that's where I'm going to be. And I remember the opening, the screening of it at the Tribeca Film Festival. He was sitting right behind me, and we got to that point, he grabbed my shoulder, he said, make certain that that's where I'm at, There was no question. He's not completely flush left. We had a long conversation about this. His mother, when she died, her remains came to the apartment, and he wanted her to be inurned at St. Peter's. So we worked out an arrangement. It's totally logical. Do it in death order. So she goes first, and then whoever was next was going to go in the middle. In this case, it was Massimo, and then Lilla. So they all kind of bumped over one. But yeah, it was I wish more people would have that kind of level of care for funerals. I encourage people to write things down. It makes it so much easier. But it was a touching memorial. It was very emotional. And where we filled in the gaps, I would like to think that we filled them in ways that he would like. Okay, we can't leave on that note. So someone else ask one other question, one more question. Yes?
Any more room in the columbarium?
There is, and in fact, we probably need to expand it. It was probably going to go over more. 2 questions. Okay, last 2. Go ahead.
My question has to do with the seat cushion.
Yes.
You had mentioned that they're in the process of being replaced again. Are the replacements also handmade?
They are. Yeah, and what you see here is the second set, and we're nearly done with it. So one of the issues is that the sheep that this particular wool is taken from have just not been having good years. And so it went out of production for a little while, and now they're back in production, but they're tinkering with the colors just a little bit. So we're not happy, and if you go up to the archive, you can compare that the pink that's there is not the right pink. It's a little too purple. And so we're hopeful. We've been working with the company to try to get that resolved. It's interesting. Alan Heller always reminds me of this. These and the Hellerware were done at the same time. And it's all, as he rightly reminds, it's all color of the promise of the rainbow of God made with Noah. So I always kind of have the Heller mugs and these. We just have to get the colors a little bit right, but we need the sheep to do their thing and the dye people to get the dye right, that dye lot right. Can I take his question next?
Do you play the organ in the church?
Not publicly. That's one of the things, not enough time to practice, so I don't even like to hear myself play sometimes. After 10 years of not having daily practice, there's just not enough time. It's a fantastic instrument. That movement went from a small 3-manual instrument to a large 2-manual organ, which means it's quite versatile. It plays literature quite well. If any of you tuned into the big Bach-a-thon this past fall that WQXR did, that was broadcast from St. Peter's. You get the last question.
You said this is the second one?
That's the second. Yeah. They wear very well. This is the second in almost 40 years. So I hope we won't do this for another 20 years, or 25 or 30 years. The next big task in the sanctuary is painting it. It hasn't had and we're approaching the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2017, so that sounds like a good time to paint the sanctuary, and we have to raise the money to do that first, because that's a big, big task. Thank you all for the questions. It's been delightful. 50th Street, near 2nd Avenue. They were Germans. Construction did not take very long. In December 1904, the congregation moved into the new church. They were also practical. They moved into the new church's basement while the sanctuary was still being completed. The dedication of the then new St. Peter's Church took place May 14th, 1905, just 2 years after that land deal with New York Central Railroad. It was a very German, neo-Gothic edifice. A set of stairs led to an elevated sanctuary replete with carved high altar and statues galore, large stained glass windows, an imposing pulpit, and very rigid pews. Another set of stairs descended to an undercroft, that basement, used for community gatherings and where 5 decades later, Elaine de Kooning would set up an art gallery. St. Peter's thrived. The neighborhood was filled with people, and brownstones, and shops, and butchers, and cobblers, and probably as a harbinger of things to come, probably a bank or two. There were neighboring churches and synagogues, even a certain piano factory on Park Avenue between 52nd Street and 53rd Street, the present-day site of the Seagram Building. You know the anglicized name, but at St. Peter's, C.F. Theodor Steinway was known as Christian Friedrich Theodor Steinweg, and he and his family gave the pipe organ for this then new church. However fascinating the history of St. Peter's may be, we do not have the time to rehearse it all here. With the little I have said, I hope that you have the sense of a strong community, a committed community, a dedicated community, a community dedicated to people, dedicated to the church, dedicated to the city of New York. A very German community in the heart of a New York with a very prominent German population. The single largest disaster in New York history prior to the September 11th attacks in 2001 changed all of that. The year was 1904. The day, June 15th. The event, a festive church picnic for members of St. Mark's Church and St. Peter's Church, both inheritors of that historic St. Matthew's Church. The passenger steamship General Slocum, chartered by St. Mark's to ferry people up the East River, caught fire at about 100th Street. The death toll from burning and drowning was over 1,000 men, mostly women and children. St. Peter's pastor, Edward Muldanky, overtaxed himself walking up and down the sidewalks where the bodies had been placed, attempting to identify each person. And then later, presiding over so many funerals, so that on June 25th, just 10 days after the disaster, he himself dropped dead. These deaths, coupled with the untold number of deaths sustained by the immediate preceding generation during America's bloodied Civil War, and still more deaths in the Great War yet to come, would dramatically and inexorably alter the population of New York City, alter the fabric of American society. A strong, honorable, and prominent German presence and participation in civic life, with roots all the way back to the Continental Congress in the personages of the Muhlenberg family. Friedrich, son of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, said to be the father of American Lutheranism, served as the first and third Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. This long and prominent tradition of German Americans would begin in these years to fade. By 1922, the neighborhood around the then new St. Peter's was already turning from residential to business. And of course, St. Peter's itself had something to do with that. Grand Central Terminal opened its doors in 1913. The Chrysler Building was completed in 1930. That very same year, construction began on Rockefeller Center. A year later, in 1931, the General Electric, or RCA Victor Building, opened just 3 blocks south of the 1905 St. Peter's Church. And from April 30th, 1931, until the topping off of the original World Trade Center tower in 1970, the Empire State Building, of course, was the tallest building in the world. The neighborhood was changing. Families moved away. The history of St. Peter's says this of the time period: we responded by building a parish house with auditorium, stage, gym, bowling alleys, meeting rooms. In other words, a second home for our members. Yet the character of our church and our mission had to change along with our neighborhood. We opened our doors to everyone during the Depression. We became an anchor of Christian service in secular, bustling Midtown Manhattan. During the Second World War, this once bustling parish house became a dormitory for servicemen passing through New York City until June of 1946, when it was closed.
It's interesting, the last time that our guest was here in this room was 5 years ago when we dedicated the Vignellis Center. And it's great to have him back. I remember at the time standing back there, and he and I connected for the first time. And I remember really wanting to have some time to chat with him because we kind of found a lot in common, and he knows so much about the history of St. Peter's and the Vignellis work. But there wasn't time then because it was the dedication and there were 1,000 people here and it was really busy. So we subsequently have had lunch in New York and have connected a couple times, and I think today is just part of that continuing dialogue, and we're very happy. We had a wonderful discussion with my class at 2 o'clock, and we're going to have another kind of roundtable tomorrow morning at 9 if anyone's interested. Please come. But our guest is pastor at St. Peter's Church in New York, and he's a graduate, an alum of Oberlin College. He's a experienced musician, I guess, an organist, and then graduate work at the Yale Divinity School. Yes, that's right. He studied at the Institute of Sacred Music, receiving a master's in divinity degree and diploma in Lutheran studies, and a bachelor of music degree from Oberlin. So we have a multi-talented guest today, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Pastor Jared Stahler.
Thank you, Roger. So the first and most important word I wish to speak today is a word of thanks. Thanks to you who have come to hear this presentation. Thanks to Professor Remington and the staff and administration of RIT and the Vignelli Archive for the invitation to speak in this series of distinguished designers, despite my being neither distinguished nor a designer. Thanks really to all of you for your hospitality, which I've already felt so warmly in the few hours I've been here on campus. Thanks especially to Lela and Massimo, whose work, whose passion, in fact, is what brings us together this day. And thanks too to the people of St. Peter's Church, who in every generation fill what we call life at the intersection with creativity, commitment, and promise. So I've sectioned this talk into 5 major parts. You've heard one of them, the thanks. I want to give a little overview of the history of St. Peter's Church, leading to the point in which it closed. Whatever German pride was left in America, it generally disappeared on account of the Second World War and the atrocities of the Holocaust, whose liberation we remember 70 years ago tomorrow. December of 1943, German language services were discontinued altogether at St. Peter's. By 1948, just 45 students were enrolled in Sunday school, down from 975 pupils and 95 teachers in 1887. With the end of the war and the GI Bill, most families that were left in this and other neighborhoods of New York City moved to Long Island or to New Jersey or to what we New York New Yorkers call upstate. I know that's downstate for all of you. If you're a fan of Mad Men as I am, you know that the show presents a view into this time period. We watch on TV what so many experienced in real life over the course of the ensuing 3 decades following the Second World War. New York City emptying out, rampant crime, collapse all around. The elevated train on 3rd Avenue just to the church's east was the border zone for drugs, prostitution, gambling, the sorts of crime movies and, yes, TV shows are made of. To the point, the original P.J. Clark's, which makes an appearance in Mad Men, as a way of showing that even a spiraling admin like Don Draper has a limit to where he will go, is in this one-time border, just a minute's walk from my office, and where many Citicorp Center deals were hashed out. Initially, the period was a great time for business and culture. 1952, the United Nations headquarters gives New York City a prominence on the world stage it had never had before. Later that same year, Lever House opens. And in 1958, the Seagram Building. In 1961, First National City Bank moves from 55 Wall Street to 399 Park Avenue. That is the entire city block spanning Park Avenue to Lexington Avenue between 53rd and 54th Streets. The by now old St. Peter's is seen here behind the construction zone. A few more of the iconic buildings worth naming. 1963, there's the iconic Pan Am building, and in 1968, the General Motors building. Then it all practically stopped. They took the decision to tear down what was called the old church and to build a partner in building Citigroup Center. And I'll talk a little bit about that process because I'm very much aware that there are a variety of stories that are float around, questions about air rights, all these sorts of things. So I'm going to try to give you a perspective on that. And then to delve a little bit into in a sense, literally what the talk, the title of the talk, Church Will Meet Vignelli, and to talk about the Vignelli process of coming into the project, and then to look at a couple of sort of examples of their particular work. Knowing the round table is tomorrow, I've that section can be changed. So if you want me to talk about something in particular and you haven't heard me talk about it, we can get to that. So, life at the intersection. The nascent community-focused venture that would eventually be called St. Peter's Church began more than 150 years ago in a rented loft above an Irish-owned animal grain feed store at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 49th Street. The church was a mission start of a church whose claim to fame is the first charter of religious tolerance in the colonies, St. Matthew's Church, at the time located on 6th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues in what was then Little Germany and is now called the Lower East Side. St. Peter's was a small but quickly growing community in a quickly growing section of Manhattan. Most everyone, German-speaking overflow from that historic neighborhood. Stereotypically German, they were organized, dedicated, motivated. Leaders saw that community moved swiftly from rented feed store into a property of their own, namely a former Presbyterian church building located at Lexington Avenue and 45th Street. On June 15th, 1903, St. Peter's sold this building to New York Central Railroad for $200,000. The construction of Grand Central Terminal began shortly thereafter. So too did construction on a new home for St. Peter's. The site chosen was fewer than 10 blocks to the north, at the intersection of Lexington Avenue and 54th Street. This structure would be the first church building the faithful people of this then 40-year-old venture would design and construct entirely from scratch. In the meantime, the community made temporary use of the Methodist Beekman Hill Church on 5th